Good evening, and welcome to this evening's presentation from Hypnosis Rising. My name is Brian Balkin, and I'm a certified hypnotherapist. The topic of our presentation is trauma and hypnosis. Trauma is a very sensitive topic, and what we're going to be discussing today is its many dimensions and its many scopes. Trauma can involve a single person. It can involve a group of people, or in some cases, it can involve entire nations. And so what we're going to do in this talk is first look at our experience of trauma. And we're going to emphasize that it is particularly important to consider the effect of trauma and the witnessing of trauma on our first responders. What we'll then do is, once we've got an understanding of that, and we will be talking and showing some pictures of situations involving trauma. And because trauma is such a sensitive subject, those of you that are still dealing with an experience of trauma and trying to process it and heal from it may find some of the information here or some of the presentations here to be a little bit triggering. So please be sensitive to that. But this is intended to provide us with a clear picture of the full scope and dimensions of trauma, that it's not a specific kind of an event. It actually is a crisis of personality. This is a perspective which is very important to us as hypnotherapists. What we do is to try to understand the relationship between the social aspect of our personality, which is in the conscious mind, and the survival aspect of the personality, which is in the subconscious. And so we'll be looking at patterns of behavior and attitudes, which not only can help us to be more robust in confrontation with trauma, but we'll also be talking about how, as hypnotherapists, we try to facilitate a dialogue between those two parts of the mind, the conscious and subconscious, in order to facilitate a rediscovery of the self. If trauma is fundamentally a crisis of identity, a loss of faith in our identity, then in therapy, what we try to do is to rebuild and reestablish that faith in our identity. And what I find in working with people who've been through trauma is that the great reward of this work is, in the end, they discover that they have unique strength in the ability to confront situations because they have the courage of having learned how to heal themselves from things that are very, very difficult. So one of the things that people that treat trauma and they give therapy for trauma have come to understand is that we all experience trauma. Trauma can be an unexpected loss. Losing your job, for example, can be a trauma. It's something that sometimes, when it happens unexpectedly, where you've committed yourself to a job wholeheartedly, being told that you're losing it and no longer be working at with the company that you're working for can really be upsetting and can stick with you for a long time. The more common forms of trauma, an injury or an illness, we have an auto accident and then we feel nervous whenever we get in the car. We are sick for a long period of time with a flu or something like that, which hits us particularly hard and we lose a lot of weight. And that can really be a shock to our system and our sense of our identity, whether we really know how to take care of ourselves. Suffering a violent attack upon our person, that's now a loss of confidence in our social identity. Do we know how to judge people? Do we choose to be in the right kinds of places? Can we live and provide for ourselves and are the ones to be cared for and love and are responsible for? The ability to live in a safe place. Natural disasters can be traumatic, having a hurricane come through or an earthquake where our living arrangements are completely devastated and we lose a lot of the wealth that we stored up. And if not just wealth, it's also mementos of important events in our life. So we feel that we've lost part of ourselves to that. Emotional or spiritual abuse, being yelled at frequently, being told that somebody else is going to represent God for you, or the power of the power of the divine presence, and telling that being told that you don't have the ability to judge what is good for you, can be traumatic if it occurs often enough and is delivered, that message is delivered to us by somebody that we consider to be an authority. A collapsing worldview can also be a traumatic event. This can be a situation where you wake up one day and realize that the political party that you've been voting for the longest period of time doesn't really represent your best interests, or a situation where you have a war that starts, or a problem such as climate change, where now all of a sudden you're beginning to realize that the way that you've lived your life all along is actually creating problems that you can't control by yourself. But along with all these other things, it's also traumatic to bear witness to these things happening to other people. One of the things that we have as human beings, which makes us uniquely human, and part of the unique experience of being human, is our ability to build rapport and empathy for those around us at a very deep level. And so when we see bad things happening to other people that we identify with as our community, that's also a trauma to us. In particular, when we have a responsibility for managing that as police officers or firemen or something like that, when we see things like that happen, we can come to the conclusion that actually we're not doing a good job and we're not quite the people that we were meant to be. Trauma can be personal, as in the case of a battered woman, but it's not just limited to personal experiences. That can be a very difficult form of trauma to survive. Just because it's a single person doesn't mean that it's not intensely violating, because what happens is that the way that the abuser has that kind of power over the individuals by isolating them from social support, making them believe that they're not worthy of receiving love. And then, in fact, no one will ever love you as much as the abuser does. But trauma can also involve entire communities. You can have an automobile, multi-vehicle automobile crash that kills a number of people. You can have a bus that overturns, a school bus that overturns on a field trip. And this can now bring other people into a state of trauma. And this tends to tax our safety services and our service providers, mental health and physical wellness, our medical service providers, a little bit more extensively, and causes them to become involved in being participants in the trauma and bearing witness to it. Natural disasters tend to involve entire communities. Our entire neighborhoods, entire cities can get involved in the trauma, where you just have a whole lot of people wandering around not quite sure what it is that they're supposed to do. And because of the disruption of roads and the physical infrastructure, our first responders typically are also challenged in terms of just organizing and bringing resources in to try to help people manage the trauma that they're experiencing and get them back into a safe situation. And then there are situations where we have kind of iconic events like the Twin Tower attacks, where an entire nation or world as a whole is kind of riveted in the witness of just a complete violation of the norms of order and human dignity and human stability that leads to trauma, and a sense of violation that we know who we are, that there are certain kinds of institutions and standards that we have relied upon our entire lives, and we see them torn away. First responders, it's important to pay attention to the trauma that's suffered by first responders, because normally they're there to protect society from trauma. They receive a lot of specialized training to this end. They are given special dispensation to use violence and to command other people to behave and expect them to respond to what they're told to do. But when that fails, they also feel very intensely a sense of responsibility for things going wrong. And what happens to them is that our acute events, our acute traumas, where it may be a car crash that we experience, and it's maybe the only serious car crash we have in our entire lives. Well, police officers and firemen see these kinds of events, routinely once a week or so. And so our acute events, our serious accidents, become just a chronic reality for them. And so over time, these first responders are very difficult to protect. They're put into situations where they are going to be exposed to trauma. And it's part of their professional expectation that they will remain in those situations, that they will provide service. And so they really have to either have special training and special orientation that enables them to take pride in doing the best they can in those situations, or they tend to numb themselves, which is part of what trauma is all about, losing faith in your own identity. So you stop feeling the things that cause you to have empathy for the people that you see going through these acute traumas. So that's kind of the overall experience with trauma. But what is trauma? And we tend to think that, trauma is something that is visible. You have a limb that's permanently disabled or amputated. You have a rupture in your living situation where somebody divorces you or just gets up and drives away and never comes back the next day. And you've got all of a sudden a family that you need to take care of, where you've kind of relied upon having that person there to help you. So there's all these different manifestations or experiences of trauma, but fundamentally there's a process that goes on inside of the body and the mind when we're confronted with the trauma, or when we experience a trauma. So the first thing is that there's a crisis. And this chart shows kind of like the kind of energy, the energy that we commit to our own experience, to solving the problems that we face in life. And prior to the trauma, we kind of have a baseline energy level, which is just randomly 1. And so we're going about our daily existence, and we're doing the things that we need to do in order to solve the problems and achieve the goals that we have got. And then there's a crisis of some kind. We have a car crash, or we get ill, or somebody screams at us. And the first thing that happens is that we kind of freeze and go into a mode where we're trying to assess just how dangerous the situation that we're in, just what is it that we need to respond to. And what happens immediately after that is that our energy outlay, the body rallies, the mind rallies, and it pulls forth resources from our reserves in our body. We have hormones in our bloodstream that are released that kind of facilitate this process. And our outlay of energy goes way, way up as we try to stabilize our situation, get ourselves back to safety, and to care for the ones that we are responsible for. And so that goes on, and sometimes that's not enough. Okay, we can't actually create a permanent safety in a situation where a tornado has destroyed our house. There's still an extra outlay of information or of energy that we've got to commit to over the long period, over a longer time period, which may go on for days or weeks or months, in order to be able to reestablish that situation that we had prior to the crisis, and get back to normal levels of energy outlay. So this is very difficult. We usually don't sleep well during this situation, and we may eat foods that aren't the best for us. We may not be able to manage our exercise and things like that. And so this is a long-term strain on the body. The body begins to eventually break down. And this is when the trauma occurs at point 3. Our response is overwhelmed, and we go into a state of hypnosis. Basically, the social identity has done the best that it can to interact with the society around and the people around, and to plan, to be creative and adapt to what's going on, and it just doesn't work. And so we go into collapse. That's the trauma. We don't feel that we can solve the problems, and so we kind of just stop committing energy to trying to solve our problems. This is a state of hypnosis where the subconscious is now in charge of just trying to keep us in a ready mode where we're going to receive support from the world around us. But it's also a state of injury where the toxins that have built up in our body, the doubts in our mind, and the sense of alienation in our spirit from other people kind of is deeply wounded. All these aspects of the self are deeply wounded. And so if we're going to recover, we need support. We need people to be with us. And quite often, this is what our first responders do. Prager and Acosta write a book called The Worst Is Over, which talks about how first responders can communicate with people who are in trauma in order to help them kind of rally and use their resources and accept aid from other people, so that this process of moving through and beyond trauma into recovery is facilitated. And Timothy Trujillo has done some brilliant work on hypnotic methods for kind of taking people out of the enmeshment that they have with that injury, that social injury, and that injury to their identity, and kind of imagining themselves as being out in a safe place and coming back with a new perspective. And this is called his 5-minute miracle. And he's delivered this to people all over the world who have been in natural disasters and other kinds of trauma. So that's the nature of trauma. The nature of trauma is it's a crisis where we respond. We get into a steady state mode where we're not quite safe and back into a normal existence. And eventually we just wear ourselves out and we lose faith in our identity. That identity is in the conscious mind. And so the subconscious gives up on supporting that identity and comes to the fore and tries to just focus on learning new behavior patterns, almost as a baby would, in order to be able to get life organized again. It's basically saying we got to start over from scratch and rebuild a personality. So that's the state of trauma. Now, what can we do to try to prevent people from becoming traumatized when they face a crisis? This is one of the things that we're beginning to understand as therapists more deeply as we study this problem. The first one is resilience. And resilience is a set of relationships to the society around us, which build our competence and capacity to deal with disruptive events. So there's kind of 5 aspects of resilience. One is first the awareness that disruptive events are possible. So there are earthquakes, and when earthquakes occur, we get our infrastructure damaged, and that can create dislocation and isolation for people on the other end of those links, is one example. The next thing that we need to do is, okay, so if earthquakes kind of happen, well, how often do they happen? How severe is this kind of disruption? Do we really want to be living in this place where earthquakes occur? And so there's this analysis that we do that helps us to anticipate how frequently will earthquakes occur? What is their severity? How many people are going to be involved and affected by an earthquake when it occurs? If it's just a minor 2-pointer, that's not a big deal. If it's an 8-pointer, that's really major. So then the next thing that we can do is kind of rehearse. What are we going to do when there's an earthquake? And we identify and look and see what goes on after an earthquake. We see what kinds of challenges people are facing, what kinds of injuries they're having, what kinds of damages there are to infrastructure. And we try to identify people in the community who can receive special training as to how to deal with those kinds of problems when they occur. And so we actually get them together and they do rehearsals, and this creates familiarity. So when the event actually occurs, they don't go into trauma themselves, but they stay within their professional role or their voluntary role to provide services to the community in the aftermath of some kind of a crisis. Once that's understood, then we need to deploy resources out and establish caches of resources that people can draw on, because earthquakes aren't happening all the time. You need to make sure that stuff is set aside for those special events. And then the last thing that we do is you want to decouple. You don't want to have a situation where all those resources are stored in a central location and the freeway is knocked down and you can't get those resources to a community that's been affected because the freeway is broken. So what happens is that you want to make sure that each community at least has what it needs to take care of the people within it, and get it back into kind of a stable condition, if not a normal condition, in the aftermath of the disaster. But this also applies to any other kind of situation that we might experience in life, whether it is as an individual or whether it is as a nation. So you have a situation where people carry mace in their purses, women carry mace in their purses. You have situations where countries have armed services and invest resources in armed services to protect themselves as a nation from invasion and disruption of their infrastructure. So that's resilience. And we can give people these tools, and so when they get into a crisis, they now have this sense that they know how to behave. They don't have to think about and invent new behavior patterns. They've been prepared by society. This is part of their identity to step into this role, and therefore they're able to manage the crisis a little bit better than if they didn't have that resilience as a quality. The second quality is hardiness, and hardiness is really an intellectual quality, which reflects confidence in our ability to adapt and learn from our experiences in life to achieve more and to improve life for ourselves and for others. So hardiness has three aspects. One is ownership. What I do makes a difference. So you have a crisis, you're not a victim of the crisis. You understand that, yes, this is happening, but I can do something in this situation, and what I do is going to make a difference. You also have confidence in your ability to learn. Okay, so I get through this and I'm going to be stronger and more effective and capable than I was before. And not just that, but if you go beyond and you say, I'm not going to just try to survive myself and be better at managing crises, I'm going to teach other people. I'm going to explain what happened to me, and I'm going to try to prepare other people to move through into either avoid or survive the kinds of situation, the kind of crisis that I was in. And so meaning means not just that I'm stronger than I was before, but that we as a community are stronger than we were before. Now, in terms of creating these qualities of resilience and hardiness in people, it turns out that the attitude of authority, and particularly in parents and adults towards children who are going through crises, because we all have crises as children, whether it be getting an F on a test that we thought we were really good at, math, and we got an F on a math test, or a situation as to where we may get a broken bone, or we may be jilted by somebody, by our best friend. So the attitude of authority is really important in terms of giving children the expectation and preparing them to adopt these behavior patterns of resilience and hardiness. So one way that authorities might cause damage to our ability to be confident in our resilience and our hardiness is to just tell us to stuff it. This is don't be weak, get over it, do your job, kind of an attitude. And so we deny ourselves. This affects our ability to believe in our own identity, where resilience and hardiness kind of strengthen our identity, cause us to believe that we as individuals at least are capable of responding effectively to the experiences that we're having. What a stuff it attitude from authority says is that there's something wrong with you to begin with, and you just shouldn't be as deeply affected by what's happening as you are. But you are. You have your emotions inside of you. So being told to get over it means don't pay attention. So you're actually divorcing yourself from your own lived experience, which is an assault upon your identity. Another response of authority is to panic. Say, now you did it. You're broken. I give up. Yeah, it's a cut. I don't know what you did to yourself with that paper and when you dragged it across your finger, but I'm taking you to the hospital. Okay, I give up. Somebody else is going to have to figure this out. So the response is that every time any little thing goes wrong, you need to find somebody else to take care of it for you. And this is, again, assault on the integrity of your identity. You are not independently capable of making judgments. You need to rely upon other people. So this undermines the sense of hardiness. The attitude that we would like to adopt as authorities is to be supportive. And this is what Acosta and Prager talk about in The Worst Is Over, is that what the supportive authority says is that was terrible. They acknowledge the experience of the person who's having the crisis, but then they reassure them, you'll get better. And I'm here to help. So you'll get better. You're hardy, okay? I'm here to help. Resilience, there's support here. Society is organized around you and will adapt to ensure that you get back to where you want to be with life. But this doesn't just apply to children. This also applies in the workplace, and it applies in our friendships and in our places of worship and things like that. All of these are places where we find authorities, and we need to act responsibly as authorities when dealing with people who are in crisis. So let's talk about the experience of the mind as it goes through a crisis and leads into trauma. And I'm going to use a hypnotherapist perspective here. This awareness that what our identity is our conscious mind is a unique perspective of hypnotherapists. And so it just gives some orientation towards the problem of healing from trauma, which is important for us to share with the world at large. Okay, so as hypnotherapists, we have this black box, which is the subconscious. And what's the landscape that black box kind of lives in? And it turns out that there's basically three aspects of our lived experience. The one that dominates us in the modern era is the social reality. And this is almost unavoidable at this point in time with the constant information flow, our online devices that are constantly bombarding us with emails, our social media accounts where we're posting things and trying to keep up with just far more people than we would be keeping up with prior to the creation of these devices. Basically you go home, you try to keep track of what your kids were doing, and that's about it at the end of the workday. But the mechanism that we have is that we do have reason, which is this cloud of the conscious mind, which goes out there and mediates between the subconscious and society. And this is a very, very powerful tool. On the other side of that social reality is the aspect of doing what we know how to do. This is our physical ability, our physical aptitudes for interacting with the environment around us, for cooking our food, for driving cars, for talking to people. We may move someplace where we don't speak the language. So all of this is in the doing part of the brain that manages our physical experience of life and our physical wellness. So that also digests our food, it does things like that. And then there's the being aspect of that very deep layer of experience that's we have a varying susceptibility to, a varying degree of perception of the spiritual aspect of life down in the soul. In the modern era, this tends to be fairly impoverished. And it's kind of unfortunate because it's actually in mediating with society and the pressures that we have from our information devices, knowing that you're not alone, and that when you feel worried and concerned that there's other people there with you who are sharing your worry and concern. The surrender of our identity to a community of trusted supporters is really important to managing the pressures that we are under from society. But due to scientific prejudice and religious hypocrisy, unfortunately, this aspect of our existence is really impoverished right now. Now, as well as this complex landscape that the subconscious got to manage, it's got basically two states of being, of mind and body, that it knows how to activate. I'm going to start with the one on the right, which is the sympathetic state, which means with the emotions in ancient Greek. And this is a situation where there's a struggle going on around us. We need to marshal energy. It's the beginning of the crisis kind of a situation. Quite often we go into a posture of fight or flight, and the person that we're interacting with realizes that actually it's not that important to them if you're going to respond this way, and we kind of all back down and try to negotiate our way through in a reasonable way. But what we quite often find in that situation is that we're demanding things from the world and we're reacting to what's happening around us. So this is a situation where it's kind of hard to maintain cohesion, social cohesion, when we're in the sympathetic mode. In the parasympathetic mode, this is the calm, resting state. And the things that we kind of focus on in that state are feed, breed. We like to collaborate because we feel that we have enough to share with others. We tend to respond reasonably to what people are asking from us when they ask us whether they can share, whether we'll share something with them. We tend to think about, you know, the benefits to us, the benefits to them, the value of the relationship. And so we will give somebody the last piece of pizza because we've already had two and they just came in the door from doing work out in the yard. And it's all okay, even though we wanted to have 3 pieces. The parasympathetic state is also the healing state. So one of the most important things to understand in dealing with trauma is that you get into, from the crisis, you get into the sympathetic state. That's that elevated level of energy expenditure. And as you struggle to get back to normal situations, you stay in a mildly activated fight or flight state. And this is why, you know, when you're in the fight or flight state, the body's not thinking about healing. It's not thinking about cleaning out toxins from tissues that are building up. It's simply trying to produce energy and create activity to be able to restore your living situation into a stable one. And what happens is you build up toxins in your system. And so it's staying in the sympathetic state, which eventually leads to that collapse, which is the trauma. If you don't get to collapse, then what happens is you get back into parasympathetic state and you begin to heal before you have kind of like permanent damage and the organism kind of gives up on trying to restore health. Now, we've talked about this partnership between the two parts of the mind. And we're going to look at this as a partnership and talk about it as a partnership. The conscious mind, which is our social identity that we lose confidence in as we enter into trauma, and the subconscious, which is the part of the mind that manages our well-being. The conscious mind is sophisticated, it's judicious, okay, and understands and has discernment with regards to whether the person that's offering you, telling you to buy a certain car is really got your best interest at heart, or whether they're just interested in getting that car off their lot. The conscious mind has goals over the long term. It defers satisfaction and may, you know, encourages us to not go off to that party where we know we're going to get drunk, and you know, stay home and continue to work because there's a deadline that you've got to make the next day. So this is an activity of the conscious mind. The conscious mind has got a reason as a mechanism for motivating and for building plans, but the conscious mind also constructs narratives. Reason enables us to predict what the consequences of actions are going to be, but that's also situational from moment to moment. Narratives are storylines that give us the sense that our life has order and meaning, that we're progressing, that we're learning. So narratives have a lot to do with this sense of hardiness that people who are able to manage trauma or able to manage crisis well have with them. The subconscious is naive. Whatever gets into the subconscious, it believes it's true, and it's going to respond and evolve behaviors to deal with that truth. It has a deep engagement with the doing and being parts of our existence, while the conscious mind tends to be really focused on the social reality. And the subconscious is associative. Okay, it doesn't have kind of a storyline. It just knows that we went into that elevator and we had a panic attack, and I just don't want to go into that elevator again, even though that the conscious mind might know for very good reasons that people go into the elevator every day and we didn't have a panic attack because of the elevator, it was something else. But still, the subconscious is going to be very resistant to that until it's been walked through and allowed to have enough experiences and assert itself and be talked to gently and encouraged to get back in the elevator and see what happens, as opposed to trying to force it to and thinking that it's stupid. That's just going to be counterproductive because it knows that it was in danger last time when we had that panic attack in the elevator. Okay, so now the challenge is that the conscious mind is the thing that filters reality, that protects us from making bad decisions. The subconscious is the part that actually gets things done. But you go into a crisis and you're in physical danger, and we need new behaviors right now. If you haven't been prepared with a kind of a resilience building exercise, okay, the subconscious just comes to the fore and decides it's going to invent new behaviors right now. The other thing that happens is because your conscious mind is pushed aside and your subconscious is charged, this is in charge. This is kind of an event all in a complete separate space. It's a complete disruption of your life. And sometimes what happens is we try to bridge over and just, okay, we dealt with the crisis. Now we can pick up our life from where we were before. We got over that illness. Okay, we survived that divorce. But the fact of the matter is that and we're going to pick up our life and just move forward as though, as though that event had never happened. The fact of the matter is, though, that when we get into trauma, that narrative integration is difficult. Our life is disrupted, and so we lose the sense of ourself again. Okay, so now what happens when we get into this trauma stage? Okay, again, here's a kind of a picture of this whole organization of the conscious mind, this critical mind, which is the barrier between the conscious mind and the subconscious to protect the subconscious from being exposed to invalid information. There's this crisis, this red lightning bolt that comes in, and the critical mind tends to kind of block immediate response to the crisis, so that we can avoid having a situation where that becomes our default mode of relating to the world as though we were in crisis. So we don't want to let that get into the subconscious and affect our long-term survival behaviors. Now, what happens is that when we get into trauma, the critical mind has been basically overloaded and wiped out. Okay, and so the happy part of our brain, that euphoria, that euphoric expectation that we have and that we receive from the world, it's all those experiences have been removed from our life. We have lots of negative experiences coming in, knowns coming in, and so the effect and the influence of fear in our decision making becomes larger and larger. The survival instinct is very readily activated by all kinds of events around us, because that euphoria center has been kind of shoved to the side and shut down. And that means that we're no longer recognizing friendly behavior patterns in other people. We no longer necessarily recognize that the world is trying to provide us support. And so everything that happens is interpreted from a place of fear. This tends to drive us through the survival instinct, to fight or flight, until we get physically overwhelmed, and then we go into freeze. So hypnosis is a state of mind that exists when this barrier between the conscious and subconscious, the critical mind, is removed. And in hypnotherapy, what we do is that we do that in a very controlled way, making an opening in a specific part of the critical mind to deal with a specific kind of a problem. What happens when you get into trauma is that the critical mind has almost been completely annihilated and lost its effect. And what that means is that the identity is in crisis at that point in time, because there's no mediation, there's no barrier between the conscious and subconscious. So what is reality like post-trauma? And there are different levels of severity of trauma. There are a certain response where non-clinical therapists can participate in helping someone to recover from their traumatic experience. This is called post-traumatic stress. And what typifies this is that the individual is still able to respond meaningfully to events and relationships. They may be anxious in those situations, and they may even have strong negative emotions which are linked to their trauma. So you may have had a boyfriend or a girlfriend that yelled at you, and your intimate partner yelled at you in general. And then what ends up happening is that you get into a new relationship, and that new friend gets excited, or that new lover gets excited and raises their voice, and now you're feeling all those emotions linked to being abused, and that all begins to come back up inside of you, because the subconscious is saying, danger, danger, this is where this lived last time. And recognizing that your new significant other is a different person. The person with post-traumatic stress will feel those emotions, but still be able to respond meaningfully to what the experience that they're having with their new lover. In post-traumatic stress disorder, the sufferer actually avoids normal activities due to the expectation that the trauma will recur. So if you got yelled at after watching a baseball game because their home team lost, okay, then what happens is that you just don't want to have to sit down and watch sports. And this is a normal activity that people engage in. It can be something that bonds you with the person that you're in a relationship with, but you just completely reject it because you have this expectation that it's going to lead to a crisis and a trauma. The psychological experience is one of hyperirritability. Again, the mind, that part of the mind that experiences euphoria is deeply suppressed. So every little thing that happens is coming through a filter of is just going to harm me. And so even things that are kind of would be just minor irritants, like leaving some shoes on a table or something like that, becomes a cause of real frustration and anger. Our dreams are affected. And this is a beautiful mechanism which we understand by all those that have suffered trauma, which is that your subconscious is going to continue because the conscious mind was out of the way during the experience of the trauma. And so we don't really remember those events distinctly and clearly. But the subconscious will protect the conscious mind after normality is restored by hanging out to those events and continuing to think about them, and it does this in dreams, and it reconsiders and turns them over in the mind again and again. And what happens is that the subconscious will continue to do this, and occasionally those dreams will pop out in the middle of the night. We'll wake up in a sweat or because we're reliving that event in our dreams. But what happens is safety, normality is restored. The beautiful thing is that the neurotransmitter that supports the fear network or the anxiety network in the brain isn't produced when you're dreaming at night. So once you get into a safe situation, there's no support for anxiety and fear in the brain when you're dreaming. If you're still in a situation that's unsafe, then there's going to be some residual of this neurotransmitter in the brain while you're dreaming. It's left over from the day. It takes a while to clean it out. But once you get into a safe situation, then those dreams begin to be released. And psychologists actually recognize that when people go from dreams where they have no control to dreams where they do have control and agency and they can stand up to their danger, that's usually a very, very strong sign that they're well on the way to healing. But there are also can be more severe kinds of waking strategies for dealing with situations of crisis or threat, perceived threat even, which is dissociation and displacement. So in dissociation, what happens is that your mind just goes off into a different space, into an imaginary reality. You're just watching what's happening to your body, or maybe not even paying attention to what's happening in your body, while the body has an experience which is reminiscent of the one that caused you the trauma. So this is a situation where the person is not responsive to the world around them, but they are also not deeply involved in the repeat or of the trauma that they had. Another aspect is displacement. So what we'll do is, rather than dealing with the trauma, the crisis and the trauma and processing it and learning how to avoid some kinds of situations, what we'll do is we'll project it into some part of the body. And we'll make that part of the body the response, and it creates tension or restriction of resources in that part of the body. This can lead into long-term illness, which can be deadly. Cancer, various different forms of degenerative neurological disease like MS and ALS and Alzheimer's disease, dementia in various different forms. Okay, but what's happening in these situations is that you've got survival skills which under normal circumstances enable you to actually navigate the social reality and take care of yourself. And this dissociation displacement moves the anomalous experience off to a different part of the personality, allowing you to continue to exercise your survival skills. One of the things that's interesting or that's difficult in these situations is that the subconscious, in using these tools of dissociation displacement, says that every time we're triggered, well, we survived again. So it can begin to rely upon these mechanisms of dissociation displacement for dealing with all kinds of problems. And because the whole goal is surviving, and we survive that trauma, and that's the most important thing, is survival, and we can just use this mechanism to survive anything. The problem is eventually that we become agoraphobic and have trouble leaving the house. But in each individual situation, the subconscious thinks it's protecting our identity. The things that psychologists identify, and you need to have a clinician involved for both, for post-traumatic stress disorder and for any of these other things, which is depression, insomnia, and paranoia, all begin to evolve and infect our relationships and propagate the trauma to other people. So how do we heal from trauma? Well, hypnotherapy has got some really beautiful techniques for dealing with this. A lot of what happens in psychiatry and psychotherapy these days is, there's a technique called eye movement for desensitization and reintegration, which basically gets the client or the patient into that REM state, that kind of dreamlike state where anxiety and fear are kind of turned off and expectation is turned off, and they kind of pull information out of their deeper parts of their mind, just become aware that, this is why I'm behaving the way that I am, and it helps them to kind of move through by, having these experiences in a very, having these recollections in a very safe environment. They're kind of able to reintegrate them and understand them as part of their life narrative. But the techniques that we use in, one of the challenges with that is that, in pulling these things up, you can have layers of an onion. And so, the mind can begin to pull stuff out that people are not quite ready for. So one of the aspects of that is beginning to do what's called vagal therapy, which is trying to establish and maintain the mechanisms, strengthen the mechanisms for managing that transition between the parasympathetic and the sympathetic states, so that the client has control of that, rather than going into the sympathetic state immediately every single time that there's a little difficulty in life. And hypnotherapy, Cheryl O'Neill at the Hypnosis Motivation Institute has developed a very powerful set of guided imagery techniques called mythical and archetypal imagery. And what happens in these situations is that the conflict is represented as some kind of mythical entity, wizard, witch, dragon, knight, something along those lines. And the client is taken into a imaginary journey where they come into confrontation with this dangerous entity or this very powerful entity. And there's a challenge that's put forward. And it's not prescribed what the outcome of the challenge is. The dragon's guarding some treasure that you want to get to. How do you get past the dragon? Some people will choose to have a conversation with the dragon, convince it that it's very important for them to have that resource. Others will get a sword out and cut the dragon's head off, one or the other. There's other possibilities, of course. The thing that happens is that this allows the conscious and the subconscious to rebuild the posture of collaboration between the two parts. We in hypnotherapy, every hypnotherapy session starts by getting the client in a very, very relaxed state that enables them to sustain calm, enables them to become more receptive to positives, because it's just words that the therapist is using and getting to this very, very relaxed state. But also what happens is, through these confrontations with these archetypal figures, basically the conscious and subconscious mind cultivate resourceful attitudes of resilience and hardiness. It also helps in these situations to vent pressure when we're in a crisis, just to be able to get down through and get back into that very stable, calm state, and just to allow the body, what animals do after they come out of a crisis is they quiver in order to release toxins from their body. But this is also something that can be facilitated in hypnotherapy, and enables people to kind of vent out. We call them abreactions in hypnotherapy. You just kind of vent out and release things that are trapped inside of them. So this is one technique that we use. Guided imagery can be done with groups of people, and it's a general, very powerful set of techniques, but there are times when you need to get really down to specifics, where part of what needs to happen, for example, if a warrior has lost a limb in combat, is that the body needs to relearn how to walk. And so that is a very specific proposition that we need to present to the subconscious, establish that this is the way that things are now, that these are the choices that we have, which is to either believe that we're broken or to adapt. And so what we do then is create this integrating life narrative in which we reframe the crisis and the trauma, we contextualize it, why did it happen, and then we redirect the energies which are being committed towards protecting the identity from further experience and interaction with the world to reconstructing it. Part of what we do in that process is to celebrate the strength that allowed the individual to get into that situation, to get through it, the bonds that they had with the people around them. And then what happens is that we want to integrate the best, the past, present, and future. So there are some qualities when we have a physical wound or an illness or something like that. There's some qualities which are qualities of self, and we don't want to lose those. We want to go back and remember what those are, give them a name. They may have been things that we just took for granted in ourselves, but actually to be more intentional in terms of understanding who we are as people, and then being able to bring those things forward to our future with us. We can also provide emotional anchors when people are confronted with triggers that enable them to kind of stay calm, be fully and actively engaged in the situation, and to be receptive to positive messages from the people around them. Dream therapy, as we said, in hypnosis, you can talk directly to the subconscious and give it very powerful suggestions about what to dream about and how to go about dreaming. And basically to tell it that, those experiences, it's just, yes, they happened. You're in a situation now where they're not going to be repeated. And so let's just let go of those and move forward for new experiences and new opportunities. With regards to dealing with our first responders, there's kind of this mentality that we've established in that community of people, which is it's characterized by the Army as battle mind, which is that everybody knows their role. You're all looking out for each other. You got each other's backs. And as long as everybody does their job, everybody will come out fine. Part of what happens is that combat and the mechanisms of violence that are freely available in American society right now, there's no guarantee. They're just the mechanisms of violence are very, very terrifying and very, very deadly. And so, you can minimize the likelihood that somebody's going to get seriously hurt, but you can't prevent it from happening no matter how much training you've got. And so battle mind is a part of the reason why the trauma is so difficult among those who, even those that aren't injured, they feel like they failed the people who are injured or who were killed. And so in Hypnosis Rising, I developed a innovative therapy called Home Heart, which is about reconnecting to those experiences which people fight for, that people train to be able to protect, the people that the average citizens of the society to experience very simple things like harmony, openness, mindfulness, empathy, and leading to relationship and trust in the end. So these are things that we can systematically look at, find the parts of the mind and the body that make us sensitive and capable of experiencing those things, strengthen them, validate them. And that's where this strength comes in, which is that when we've been through a trauma and we have to go through the process of reconstructing our personality, reconstructing our identity, the identity that we had before the trauma, 90% of the time, 95%, 99% of the time, it's just something that just happened to us. It's just something that came up from our life experience, and we weren't really conscious and intentional about it. When you go through a crisis that leads to a trauma, there's this conscious stock taking of who you are as a person. You become a full owner of yourself, and that gives one a great deal of power. So just to summarize this all, trauma is hypnotic. It's going to lead to a situation in which the very most vulnerable parts of your mind and personality are exposed to danger. When it's serious enough, it creates a long-term susceptibility to being in hypnosis. And so what we do as hypnotherapists is we try to help people take control of that transition, of that outcome, and to heal themselves with intent. Thank you so much for sharing this presentation, your attention to this presentation, and God bless you, and wishing you wellness.